Peter Bird, you should ask your question.
Hello. As a linguist, do you think texting and emailing are dumbing down our methods of communication, and could they have negative long-term effects?
Well, if I can drop the first three words, as a linguist, I have nothing to say about this. Linguistics doesn't tell you anything about it. I mean, in general, the sciences just don't tell you very much about matters of human concern. They're not that advanced. But as a human being, I have an opinion, and I'm sure you do. Texting, emailing, Twitter, all that, it's obviously been very effective for all kind of reasons, like what Jane just described, or the January 25th movement in Egypt. That was, to a substantial extent, a Twitter-type movement. And there are many other examples. I mean, that's the way people get organized, and communicate, and so on. It's the way my daughter talks to her daughter in Japan, let's say, that kind of thing. I don't like it very much, frankly, for exactly the reason you mentioned. One of the consequences is that there's a kind of a cheapening of discourse. You know, things that you can't say in whatever it is, 200 characters, don't exist. Well, you know, any serious thought about any topic is going to take some attention, thought, qualifications, you know, looking at various aspects of it and so on. And that's excluded by the medium. So what tends to happen is, you can see it with activist movements, which are using these methods very effectively, but there's kind of like a pressure there inherent for them to turn into cults in which you repeat catechisms, you know, things that you can say briefly and quickly and that don't have qualifications and don't consider the opposite, considerations that might be to the contrary of the conclusions and so on. In general, that's not a good thing. And it's not just these new technology. I think that's been happening much more generally. I can see it. You know, I've been teaching for 60 years, and you see differences. Young people don't read anywhere near as much as they used to. I have friends who teach undergraduate history, say, and they tell me that they simply cannot use the texts that they used to use 30 years ago. Students can't understand them. You know, they look at the long paragraphs and eyes glaze over. It's not what you're used to. I can see it with my own grandchildren. You know, they're stimulus hungry. Like I have a grandson who lives not too far away, a high school student. My daughter brings him over often Sunday night, and he's supposed to do his homework. Of course, he hasn't done anything all weekend. So he sits down Sunday night carrying out the activity that he calls doing his homework. He's got a laptop. He has earphones with all kind of whatever it is going in there. Alongside the whatever he's doing on the laptop, he's communicating with about 10 friends, you know, about nothing, you know, like I'm standing up or, you know, I'm having a sandwich or something. And all of this has got to go on at once, you know. And if it's anything less than that, he gets kind of nervous and jittery. Well, I think the Twitter texting effect is contributing to that. I mean, I've noticed that, say, with my grandchildren, emailing is no good because that's too slow and too extended. You know? So it has to be something much shorter. And when I said that my daughter communicates with her daughter by texting or Twitter or something, it's because her daughter won't, my granddaughter won't look at anything longer than that, like emails out, you know. And these are negative. I think these are harmful effects that go along with the very useful effects of the new technology. That's kind of like back to the hammer, you know. It can be helpful or harmful. Depends how you use it. I'm sure younger people here are all familiar with this way more than I am. But
We're really moving around on these questions. I mean, moving from language and communication. Next, we have Ian Roth and his question on war crimes.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. My question relates to politicians and war crimes. Is it a war crime when a democratically elected leader creates a false prospectus for war?
Well, you should take a careful look at recent British law, English law. After 7/7, the attack in London, new laws were passed, which are worth reading carefully. They make it a crime to intentionally glorify or encourage possible ultimate acts of terror. Actually, somebody's being tried right now who runs a bookstore because in the bookstore there's material from jihadis, material that we all ought to read. You want to understand them, you better know what they say. But the charge is, I just read it last night, that by having this material and distributing it, he's violating British law because it might encourage somebody to think about entering into terrorist activities, or it might glorify them and so on. Well, let's go back to the democratically leader constructing a false prospectus for war. I mean, the aggression, if anybody cares about the Nuremberg Tribunal, aggression was defined there, war, as the supreme international crime, different from all other war crimes in that it includes all of the evil that follows. So say take Iraq. The crime was not, it's just straight outright war crime. It's a crime of aggression. But the crime of invading Iraq includes everything that happened afterwards. The sectarian warfare, the destruction, the robbing of the museum, the rebels, the millions of people who fled because life became impossible. All that is part of the Bush, Blair, etc. war crime. Well, did they create a false prospectus for war? You may recall that when the U.S. and Britain went to war, there was what Bush and Blair and the rest called a single question. There was a single question. Later they made up all kind of other stories. But the single question was, will Saddam Hussein give up his weapons of mass destruction? Well, I don't know if that's what the questioner was thinking of, but that's like a paradigm example of a false prospectus for war. And if you accept British law, at least, that's incomparably worse than distributing books on terrorism. That's laying the basis in the public mind for major war crimes, which were then executed. Is that a war crime? I mean, I don't think there's a statement in international law that says it's a war crime, but if it should be morally criminal, whether it's legally criminal or not. And it's the kind of thing, that's the kind of reason why people should be participants, not spectators. Why, say, WikiLeaks, if it helps tell you what leaders are up to, is a very good thing. And why democracy is a good thing, real democracy, in which you participate. So you can't be led around by the false propaganda of leaders who have other goals in mind. Now, speaking of terror, I don't know how many of you looked at the Chilcot inquiry, but one of the interesting revelations there from I forgot her name, the woman who's the head of British intelligence, whatever her name is, she testified that Britain and the United States, when they were planning for the war, both were aware that invading Iraq was going to increase the threat of terror. Okay, actually it did, much more than anyone anticipated, by about a factor of 7 the first year. But what that tells you is that the leaders who you're electing don't care about the security of the population. They're willing to undertake actions which they know are going to endanger the populations. Okay, it's not the first time in history that that's been the case. What I mentioned about the leaks from the ambassador in Pakistan are the same kind of thing. They're taking actions which they have reason to believe might lead to a nuclear bomb in London, but taking them for other reasons. And in general, security of the population is not a high priority for political leadership. They have other things in mind. The same on the global warming issue. What the priority is making profit in the next quarter, not the fate of the species. Well, these are all reasons for having a functioning democracy. And I think that it comes up in all of these questions, but it comes up here too.
Our next questioner is Gaith Al-Jayusi. Now, before Gaith asks his question, we just want to say thank you, Gaith, because without Gaith, Noam would not be here in Cardiff. Since Gaith was the one, I think, who asked him to come and speak, and Noam will be in St David's Hall, sold out with a massive audience tomorrow, but in a very different kind of environment to the opportunity to ask these questions. So Gaith, wherever you are, the floor is yours.
How can the British academic and intellect and the ordinary British person tackle the current political crises in the UK in the presence of a right-wing conservative government when the only credible alternative is a Labour government that also has right-wing policies and unfortunately has got the blood of many Iraqis and Afghanis on its hands?
Well, first of all, it may be the only political alternative, but it's not the only alternative. I mean, take a look at your counterparts in Tahrir Square, the young people who organized the January 25th movement. They faced problems much harsher than a right-wing conservative government. They were facing a brutal military dictatorship with murderous security forces, torture in prisons, no political options, and so on. They didn't just sit there. They did something about it. And under the much less harsh conditions, the much more benign conditions that people like us face, there's a lot more that we can do. There are plenty of options. It takes effort. It's costly. Anybody who does become involved in serious activism for social change, reform, and so on will probably pay a cost. But there are enormous gains that are possible. So what can British and academic intellectuals do? Almost anything they feel like. They may not be praised, but they're not going to be put in prison and tortured. It's a big difference.
And James Nee, your next question.
Hi, Noam. I think you've already kind of touched upon this, but over the course of your illustrious career, have world affairs become increasingly familiar, or there are still areas that seem alien to you? And by that, I mean areas that can still shock and surprise.
Take Twitter, for example. Totally alien to me. I can't get near it. It's a kind of a depressing question because the answer is virtually everything. I mean, even in the fields in which I've worked all my life, say professionally, the more you learn, the more you realize, the less you know. I mean, what happens is standard in the sciences, but everywhere else too. You learn more. You think you're approaching some kind of a horizon, but in fact the horizon is receding. And the more you learn, the more you see that horizon is very far away. It's true, and I could give you examples from my own field, but it's true in the core sciences. Take, say, physics, the star of the sciences. They got some problems. Like one problem is they can't find 90% of the mass energy in the universe. It's postulated because otherwise nothing works, but can't find it. Can't find any evidence that it's there. That's a pretty serious problem. I remember about 10 years ago, this one was finally overcome. About 10 years ago, this big, the Hubble telescope, which is out in space, it was bringing in tons of information about outer space. And there was a time when it turned out that that had very powerful evidence that the universe was considerably younger than its oldest stars. Well, that's a pretty serious problem. And in any field you are, that's what you find all the time. When you turn to human affairs, our understanding is extremely thin. Almost everything is, you're learning all the time from other people, from your children, your friends, your enemies. So depths of human possibilities and capacities that we can barely perceive. When you look at different fields, I mean, sometimes when I'm having a boring interview on the telephone and I'm trying to think about something else because the questions are too boring, and I start looking around the room where I work, full of books piled up to the sky and so on, and all different kinds of topics, and start calculating how many centuries would I have to live reading 24 hours a day, every day of the week, to make a dent in what I'd like to learn about things. It's pretty depressing. So the answer to the question, I think, is, we have little bits of understanding, glimpses, a little bit of light here and there, but a tremendous amount of darkness, which is a challenge. Life would be pretty boring if we understood everything. It's better if we don't understand anything. And know that we don't. That's the important part.
And our last question for this evening comes from Lynn Reynolds.
What advice would you give to the members of a young democracy, such as the National Assembly for Wales?
Well, I think I'm sure you have better advice than I do, but I mean, the best advice would be to try to make those words real. Make it a real functioning democracy. A democracy in which the population participates, in which people understand, in which they deliberate, in which they work things out, they develop a view of the future, they implement their own decisions through their representatives, elected, recallable representatives. Those are ways of becoming a real democracy. And it can make a huge difference. And the stakes are very high. I mean, we're at a point of human existence which never existed in the past. There was nothing like it in the past. There really are decisions now that will determine the fate of the species. That's never been true in the past. I mean, there were plenty of problems, famines, wars, destruction. But we're now at the point where whether the species will persist is a question. That's quite a heavy burden. And it has to be undertaken quite seriously. If you want a final grim forecast, one of the great modern biologists, the grand old man of American biology, Ernst Mayr, died recently, about age 100. He was once in a debate with Carl Sagan, who you may know, the astrophysicist. They were in a debate about the chances that there's intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. And Sagan approached it from the point of view of an astrophysicist. He said, we can kind of calculate how many planets there are out there that are kind of more or less like ours and how long they've been there, and we understand a little bit about evolution, so chances are they've developed intelligent life. Mayr approached it from the point of view of a biologist. He said, look, we have one example, Earth. It's the only example we know. There have been tens of billions of species on Earth. We know something about their history and their fate. And he said there are a couple of generalizations we can draw. One generalization, as he put it, is that it's better to be stupid than smart. And what he meant is, there's a notion of biological success means basically how many of you are there. You know, a species is successful if there's a lot of you around. So who's successful? Well, bacteria, which mutate very quickly, and beetles, which are stuck in a particular niche and can't get out of it, they're doing great. On the other hand, if you go up the scale of what we call intelligence, there are fewer and fewer creatures, and the species it has a much shorter lifespan. So there are very few big mammals around, partly because humans killed most of them. But even apart from that, the only big mammals of which there are many are the ones that are domesticated by humans. In fact, there are very few humans around until pretty recently. 10,000 years ago, it was a sparse population. And that's nothing in evolutionary terms. So his point is, well, look, intelligence is apparently a lethal mutation. It's what we call intelligence. It's harmful biologically. He then ended by saying that if you look at the species we know about on Earth, roughly their average survival span is about 100,000 years. That's us. It's getting to about 100,000 years. So we have a choice as to whether to falsify that generalization or not. But it's a real generalization and worth thinking about.
Right. Noam Chomsky, thank you very much. I think it's interesting, just on that analogy, the only climate change joke I know is actually, and it does mix with your astrophysicist and your biologist, it's two planets talking to each other. And one says, I feel really itchy and I don't know what's wrong. And the other says, what is it? Do you know what it is? And the first one says, it's called Homo sapiens. And the next planet says, don't worry, it won't last long. So on that note, on your behalf, can I thank Noam Chomsky for an extraordinary evening. We've ranged from climate change to WikiLeaks, Pakistan, small countries' leadership, Arab world, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, religion, nuclear weapons, oil, language, tools for communication, short-term versus long-termism in politics, Aristotle's politics, inequality, war crimes, British laws on terrorism. How many of you knew about the British laws on terrorism? The Chilcot inquiry. It's been a real privilege. It's been immensely enlightening, and we're very proud that you chose to join us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Noam Chomsky.